In this video, we continue our journey in Northwest Illinois along the Chicago Great Western route from Chicago to Olwine, Iowa, visiting all of the disused stations along the way. In this chapter, we will visit two more disused stations in the hills of Daviess County, the first being the remains of North Hanover, and the second the remote town of Rodden. Finally, we will explore the remarkable remains and history of a monumental in situ artifact.
West from Elizabeth, the next station along the Chicago to Olwine route is North Hanover, located a little less than 3.5 miles southwest by train. To get there, we depart from the Elizabeth Depot, heading west along U.S. Highway 20. We drive for a little over 2.5 miles until we reach Illinois Route 84. We turn left, bearing south-southwest. We travel a little more than 2 miles along 84. Then to our left is the long driveway of a farmer whose family owns the North Hanover property.
The station depot was located about 700 feet due east of Illinois Route 84, and a little over 2,400 feet due north of where Sawmill Road meets Illinois Route 84 to the south, in Hanover Township, Daviess County, Illinois. Today, the site of the former railyard lies on private property, a few hundred feet beyond a private driveway.
Despite its rather low-key appearance, nestled within the Daviess County hilly landscape, this location turned out to be one of the most interesting station sites, both from a historical and artifact perspective, that we have visited since starting our journey. We knocked at the door of the gentleman whose family owns the property and requested permission to view the site of the former North Hanover depot. He could not have been nicer or more accommodating. Not only did he grant permission, but he took us on a personal tour of the station site, as well as to some astounding artifacts by the Apple River, which we'll discuss in later detail. Our host, Tim, who requested not to appear on camera, first took us to the former station site.
This station was originally referred to as Truesdale Station, in deference to James Truesdale, the elderly farmer who sold a portion of his land to the Chicago, St. Paul, and Kansas City Railway back in 1887 for the purpose of a railroad right-of-way and station stop. His remaining farm property stood on both sides of the railroad. James Truesdale was born in 1814 and was one of the earliest U.S. settlers in this region, acquiring land patents from the U.S. government in 1848. Like many new station stops to the east, such as Bolton, Myrtle, and Egan, there was no prior community at Truesdale. This was a new startup that both the Chicago Great Western and James Truesdale hoped would one day flourish.
The settlement of Hanover, 2 miles to the south, was the site of a major woolen mill and was keen for a railway to travel through their town. Attempting to entice either or both the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad or the Chicago, St. Paul, and Kansas City Railroad to build a station in their locale. But the best that the Chicago, St. Paul, and Kansas City would do was 2.5 miles to the north, in the form of the Truesdale Station. Their reasoning may have been that the trip through Daviess County was already circuitous and expensive to build, and rerouting further south was going in the wrong direction.
In 1893, the station yard included the depot, which was of the classic CGW design, a wooden structure with gable ends, wide eaves, and stick-style decoration, likely being about 40 feet by 20 feet in dimension. The rail yard featured a siding plus a long passing track, which extended beyond the road to the west and almost a half-mile eastward to just west of the Apple River. Stockyards stood on the south side of the tracks and about 100 feet east of the depot.
By 1895, the Chicago Great Western had not lost sight of the town of Hanover to the south and began to contemplate a spur or some other arrangement in order to handle the freight from their woolen mills. In a bid for that interest, they renamed the Truesdale Station to the North Hanover Station. Perhaps the CGW hoped that this might stimulate the town of Hanover to migrate further north, towards the railway depot, just as places like Pearl City had done previously.
Meanwhile, the North Hanover railyard continued to expand. By 1896, there may have been an ice house built near the railyard, so as to accommodate ice that was cut from the Apple River in wintertime, to be freighted to nearby communities. A grain house was also added to the railyard in 1897. Although not the rapid growth that the CGW might have hoped, the out-of-the-way location was beginning to show signs of life, and as a result, the CGW made another attempt to fully secure the lucrative Hanover freight by formally proposing a spur from their North Hanover Railway to Hanover, 2.5 miles to the south. They even went so far as to file articles of incorporation with the Joe Daviess Circuit Clerk's office. But for reasons unknown, this new stub never moved forward. Instead, the station was soon to be marred by one of the worst train wrecks in Chicago Great Western history.
On the evening of Monday, January 23, 1899, at a little past 9 p.m., an eastbound freight train pulled into the station and waited on the main line for a soon-to-arrive westbound freight train, which had orders to pull into the passing track just west of the Apple River to enable the eastbound train to continue. The waiting eastbound train was a double-header freight train, meaning it was being pulled by 2 engines, a common practice to assist trains with heavier loads through the hilly countryside of Joe Daviess County. As the train waited, it noticed the westbound train at a distance rounding the curve ahead, descending a steep grade at high speed, then soon passing over the Apple River Bridge. In horror, they immediately were aware that the train was not slowing down, nor did it switch onto the passing track, but instead kept bearing down on the main line. The train operators on the eastbound train only had a moment to jump from the doubleheader before the westbound train slammed into them at 50 miles per hour. The force of the collision hurled several cars into the depot, wrenching it several feet off its foundation, tearing up hundreds of yards of trackway, and destroying the telegraph circuitry, the telegraph operator jumping to safety only at the last moment.
The trainmen of the westbound train, perhaps not expecting the doubleheader freight train to be sitting at the station, and perhaps due to the low light, had little warning of the collision, and were so caught in the mangled mess of the wrecked trains. The engineer, 41-year-old Alexander Thompson, was entangled in the wreckage and died hours later as they attempted to free him. He left a wife and 2 small children in Marshalltown, Iowa. 26-year-old fireman Michael E. Devereaux, also of Iowa, was pinned against the red-hot boiler. Still alive and in excruciating pain from searing burns, he pleaded with rescuers to end his life and suffering before expiring in the early morning hours. The brakeman, Archibald Vandenberg, 31 years of age and from Chicago, was wedged tightly against the boiler head. He, too, died as they removed him from the wreckage, leaving a wife.
A crowd of several hundred people poured in from the countryside the next morning to view the wreckage. Word had quickly gotten out, in spite of the fact that the telegraph operator had to walk 4 miles to Elizabeth to report the accident. All totaled, the accident resulted in 3 destroyed engines, 20 wrecked train cars, hundreds of yards of damaged trackway, and 3 deaths. Damages for the railway were estimated at $75,000, or close to $2 million in today's money. An inquest following the wreck attributed the fault of the accident to the westbound train engineer, Alexander Thompson, for failing to follow his train orders. Some speculated that he thought he was ahead of schedule and had beat the eastbound train to North Hanover, thinking that the train might still be at Rodden, a station to the immediate west.
Despite the failed Hanover spur of 1898, the CGW was still intent on garnering the Hanover freight trade. and so in the summer of 1901 built a siding which extended 1,800 feet southeast of the depot, curving towards the Apple River to the south. At the banks of the river, they built a coal chute to run coal from the train cars onto an awaiting freight boat. To carry this freight, the CGW built a boat with a carrying capacity of 15 tons, being 16 feet wide by 54 feet long. This small barge was to ferry freight, especially coal, from the North Hanover Station to Hanover via the Apple River.
Also by this time, it seems that the North Hanover Station had been repaired from the catastrophic 1899 accident and received a fresh coat of paint in the summer of 1902. In spite of safety improvements, this stretch of railway continued to see accidents and derailments for years to come.
Not satisfied with the CGW's freight boat solution, which focused primarily on coal, the citizens of Hanover finally took matters into their own hands in the summer of 1906, when they raised their own private capital to create a new short railway, consisting solely of a spur line from Hanover to North Hanover. In 1907, the Hanover Railway opened as an independent narrow-gauge railroad, running a distance of 2.5 miles due south from North Hanover to the west of the Apple River. On a small scale, they hauled wood, freight, and merchandise to and from the small hamlet, and it finally gave the residents of Hanover a connecting passenger service with the Chicago Great Western. Passenger service was achieved via a gasoline-powered motor coach, affectionately referred to as the Dinky.
The next major development in the North Hanover rail yard came in 1912. In spite of the Chicago Great Western having deep wells and water tanks at the Elizabeth and Woodbine stations to the east, these sources of water proved troublesome, as the water was hard, filled with limescale, and not good for steam engines. So instead, in 1912, they tapped a new water supply of good quality water from the Apple River, just a third of a mile east of the North Hanover Station. They installed a pumping station along its west river banks, just north of the trackway, and then dug a long pipeline from there to a large 120,000-gallon water tank with two 12-inch water columns, perched on a rise just 100 feet north of the North Hanover depot. The elevated tank allowed them to gravity feed the thirsty steam engine trains.
This new installation enabled the railway to eliminate water plants at Elizabeth and Woodbine, as well as Rodden to the west. The new water plant worked out well, except for an exceptional deep freeze of January 1918, when the water tank froze and burst, releasing 100,000 gallons of water across the train yard and surrounding fields. There are still remains of the old water tank up along the ridge above the depot yard. There are 2 or 3 concrete boxes at the base of where the water tank once stood, likely being the frost boxes or frost pit, where the water entered the tank from beneath the ground.
Our host, Tim, also pointed out the remains of the small pump house along the west banks of the Apple River, just to the north of the bridge, likely of wood construction, housing a gasoline engine that drove the water pump. This is perhaps another concrete frost box. There may still be a 6-inch wide metal pipe running from this box to the frost boxes for the water tank.
Perhaps due to all the tribulations that the North Hanover depot had been through since its construction in 1888, a new depot was built in 1914, likely on the original foundation. This building was 16 feet by 43 feet in dimension, with a concrete foundation and wide eaves, but this time with a hip roof. At this same time, the CGW was promoting excursion rides from Dubuque and Elizabeth to the North Hanover Station for picnicking along the nearby Apple River.
Innovations from the Chicago Great Western continued in the mid-1920s. Perhaps inspired by the Hanover Railway, they experimented with gasoline-powered motor coach service along the CGW Railway, operating between their hub in Olwine, Iowa, and East Stockton, Illinois. The train cars looked something akin to street trolley cars and had a seating capacity of 60 passengers, including luggage. They were said to be cheaper to operate than the regular steam-powered passenger trains. In 1951, a collision reminiscent of the 1899 catastrophe occurred at North Hanover, when a freight train waiting for another train to pass proceeded forward when the late train did not appear within the allotted wait period. A head-on collision ensued shortly thereafter. Fortunately, no one was killed in this accident.
By the late 1940s, with passenger service at a low ebb, the Chicago Great Western reduced passenger train service to a single train per day in 1949. Coincident with this change, service from the Aiken Station in the west to a point near North Hanover was reduced to a single trackway. Then, in 1956, passenger service along this route was eliminated entirely, with the final passenger train making a stop in August. Finally, sometime around 1970, the old depot was torn down.
The foundation of the depot is still evident in the ground, just below the water tank on the rise to the north of the rail yard. The depot sat between the Chicago Great Western tracks and the Hanover Railway tracks. The CGW's main line and passing tracks were located to the north of the depot's foundation, while the Hanover Railway tracks were located to the south of the depot building. It needs to be remembered that this was a rail yard for both the Chicago Great Western as well as the Hanover Railway, from 1906 until at least 1934. There are also foundations for at least two other structures on the south side of the station grounds. The largest of the two, to the west, is perhaps 100 feet by 30 feet in dimension. This building appears to be down to the foundation even by the 1940 aerial photos. Perhaps this was originally the grain house mentioned in newspaper reports.
The second structure is smaller, perhaps 12 feet wide by 20 feet long, with a hatchway or bulkhead to the south, and appears to have included a basement, possibly for cold storage. Tim, our host, suggests it may have been a creamery, with the lower and cooler part of the building where the dairy products were temporarily stored. Another alternative might be an ice house where ice was stored. Still another thought might be that it was the station agent's house. There is also a small concrete box just to the east of this structure, about 3 feet by 4 feet in size. It is possible that this container may have been some sort of frost box for water spigots and controls.
With the new station located on his farmland, James Truesdale optimistically plotted the town of Truesdale Station in the early 1890s, with 26 40-foot by 80-foot lots along the north-south county road, and with 15 50-foot by 80-foot lots backing up to the rail yard running east-west. But unlike many of the Chicago Great Western stations to the east, which blossomed into small communities or towns, at North Hanover, the presence of the station never really materialized into anything more than a few buildings beyond the station area.
North Hanover was never able to establish a post office, despite the presence of the Chicago Great Western Mail Service, which meant that general stores and other sundry businesses were less likely to locate there.
The nearby Apple River, although typically a peaceful and meandering waterway, has proven troublesome over the decades with sporadic flooding. One of the most recent floods occurred in 2017, when much of the lowlands near the river, including the former North Hanover Station area, were underwater. Today, the former North Hanover site is on privately owned farmland, nestled between Illinois Route 84 and the Apple River. To the west of Illinois Route 84, you can still see the ridge of the former CGW right-of-way, disappearing off to the northwest towards Rodden.
Without question, the most spectacular Chicago Great Western artifact remaining near the North Hanover station yard today is that of the former Apple River Bridge, located about 1,700 feet due east of the North Hanover Depot site. This bridge has stories that easily rival the infamous Winston Tunnel to the west in terms of deaths, accidents, and tragedies.
The Apple River Bridge at North Hanover was a substantial structure with massive stone abutments, built mostly in 1887. The bridge was originally a single span of 186 feet, an iron bridge with a Pratt truss design, 26 feet tall, 12 feet wide, and standing 40 feet above the Apple River below. The monumental limestone blocks for the bridge abutments were quarried from a local pit just 2 miles due west of Elizabeth along the Apple River. There is still a quarry there today, just to the north of Illinois Route 20. These massive blocks were floated downriver to North Hanover via flatboats to the bridge construction site. It cost the railway $36,000, or about $1.3 million in today's money, to build this bridge, and it was completed in the first few weeks of January 1888, shortly before the opening of the railroad.
But this new structure was not to last. Just 4 weeks after the bridge opened, in the late morning of February 15th, a freight train consisting of about a dozen cars was traveling west from Elizabeth. About 70 laborers working on the Winston Tunnel had just boarded this train at Elizabeth, all crowded into the train caboose, and heading to the tunnel to collect their wages. A little more than half-mile east of the bridge, at the top of a ridge, one of the forward freight cars broke an axle, breaking the journal boxes completely. The broken freight car derailed and thumped along the railroad ties. Once the engineer realized what was happening, he attempted to slow the train, but as the train was on a very steep grade, dropping 50 feet from the ridge to the Apple River Bridge in a span of a half mile, the train's speed only increased.
They held their breath as the train passed at high speed over the bridge, the engine and the first few cars traveling safely. But when the derailed freight car entered onto the bridge, the broken axle caught almost immediately between the bridge's widely spaced rail ties, the high speed and momentum of the train levering up the girders and suddenly twisting the entire iron superstructure. The metal bridge heaved and groaned under the massive strain, and within moments, the badly contorted bridge plunged 40 feet down into the iced-over Apple River, taking with it the broken freight car and the 5 freight cars following it. Miraculously, the train couplings to the fore and rear of the train sheared off and gave way, preventing the doomed cars from dragging the rest of the train with them, saving the lives of both the engine operators and the railroad workers in the rear of the train.
One young man, however, was not so fortunate. The engine fireman, 29-year-old Bernard R. Donnelly, was caught in the wrecked cars as they plunged to the icy river below. His death was believed to have been instantaneous. Bernard had been supporting his widowed mother, who resided at Galena. His elder brother, James, later collected his brother's remains, which had been brought to a local farmhouse, likely that of James Truesdale. Bernard Donnelly was later buried in St. Michael's Cemetery in Galena.
Within a matter of days, a large work crew built a new wooden trestle around the wreck and spanning the river to enable train traffic to flow once again. By late April, the railway had installed a replacement iron bridge spanning the Apple River and of similar design, with the possible exception of the rail ties now being more closely spaced.
An inquest was held in the weeks that followed the accident. finding the railway responsible for the death of Bernard Donnelly, and censoring the train's engineer for what they believed to be a reckless rate of speed over a new piece of railway line. The damage to the bridge, train cars, destroyed freight, and lost revenues was estimated at $75,000 to $100,000, or over $3 million in today's money.
But this was not the only tragedy to have occurred at this storied bridge. 11 years later, the Chicago Great Western made plans for a new bridge to be installed at this location to accommodate the newer and heavier engines and trains. This was also likely in response to the terrible accident that occurred at North Hanover in January of 1899, shoring up infrastructure in the troubled area in order to calm the nerves of investors. In March of 1899, they began driving new piles for a new pier to be placed into the middle of the river, which cut the supported span in half. They may have also replaced or shored up the original stone abutments, likely increasing them in height, as part of their work included regrading the approaches to the bridge, thereby reducing the steep gradient from the east.
By September, the new iron bridge was nearing completion. Unlike the 1888 bridge, which was of Pratt Truss design, it is likely that the new iron bridge, with the additional pier, was of the pony plate girder design. During the afternoon of September 13th, a derrick mounted on a flat car was handling heavy stones while reinforcing the new midstream pier, when it suddenly overturned and flipped over the side of the bridge, plummeting into the river. The derrick operator, 38-year-old Swedish immigrant Carl Nelson of Minneapolis, was crushed to death in the tangled wreckage of the derrick. 3 of his co-workers, standing on the derrick when it flipped, fell into the river and onto the riverbank 40 feet below, also sustaining serious injuries. A coroner's inquest held a few days later put the responsibility for the accident upon the unfortunate derrick operator, Carl Nelson.
The midstream pier also shows that it was doubled in size sometime after the 1899 reconstruction, with a much cruder form of construction, using poured concrete in place of cut stone. This was almost certainly at the time when they double-tracked the route from Kent to the east all the way to Galena in the 1907 timeframe. This enabled them to carry 2 trackways over the Apple River span.
The next station along the CGW line was Rodden, located a little more than 3 miles to the northwest. We inadvertently took the long way getting there, turning a 4.5-mile journey into an 8-mile trip, but we'll explain our route nonetheless, giving you a tour of the scenic Joe Daviess countryside. We left our host's driveway and turned left back onto Route 84, before quickly turning right onto Sawmill Road. We inadvertently missed a turn here heading north, and instead continued on this road west and southwest for almost 2.5 miles. When we reached Blackjack Road, we turned right, heading northwest. Blackjack Road wound around for more than 2.5 miles, until we came upon Girard Hill Road, where we turned right, heading back eastward. Another 2.25 miles along this road brought us to Irish Hollow Road. We turned right, bearing east-southeast. Just a half-mile down this road brought us to the Rodden Station area, to the right or west of the road.
Pinning down the exact location of the Rodden Depot is a bit trickier than most, as it was a small wooden building tucked in the leeward side of a hill where ran the Chicago Great Western Railway. However, based upon old survey maps and plat maps, the Rodden Depot likely stood about 330 feet perpendicular from Irish Hollow Road to the southwest, to the left of the frame house still standing along the road, roughly aligned with the utility pole. It would have stood on the southwest side of the railway tracks, meaning the automobiles would have had to drive across the railway tracks to park.
As this was a very small community and the hillside topography was an unusual sight, the Rodden Depot was a small frame building, perhaps 15 feet by 20 feet in size, at least based upon the one known photograph of the Rodden Depot, taken circa 1925. As much as we know about the North Hanover site, we know relatively little about the Rodden Station, as it was somewhat out of the way. Local newspapers only rarely mention the town or the station. What we do know is that the original depot was destroyed by fire in 1894. Presumably a new depot was built within the matter of a year. A feed mill was added to the yard in 1893, and a creamery in 1895, along with stockyards. This station received about 240 gallons, or 20 cans of milk daily for transport.
In the late 1890s, large teams of workers installed stone culverts along the railway near Rodden, as well as backfilling many of the nearby trestle structures with earth. Their work also included extending the siding at the Rodden Station. Several years later, in 1905, the Chicago Great Western laid a double track between Winston and Rodden, and then built a water station for the sum of $1,900, or about $45,000 in 2020 money. As we've learned, this water station was removed several years later when the North Hanover water system came online.
But even with these improvements, it was only a few years later in 1907 that local newspapers were reporting that the Chicago Great Western was considering shutting down the Rodden Station. But the CGW quickly denied this report, and instead committed to further improvements of the Rodden Depot and rail yard, indicating that one improvement would be a new depot structure.
Like the other stations in this hilly terrain, the Rodden Station saw more than its share of accidents. One of the first was in 1896, when a westbound freight train derailed just west of Rodden, hurling 6 train cars into the ditch along the railway. An even worse accident occurred in 1902, when a head-on collision occurred between a passenger train and a freight train at the station. The westbound freight train was just starting to pull into the siding when an eastbound passenger train collided with the freight train. Surprisingly, there were no serious injuries in this accident. One of the last large accidents occurred in July of 1941, when 8 train cars derailed and went into the ditch, including 2 tankers and cars filled with merchandise, mostly cookies. Where is that milk train when you need it?
As with other stations in this area, the last passenger service went through in 1956. The depot itself was likely taken down in the 1960 to 1970 timeframe. Today, the station site is situated on private property, owned primarily by the Inn at Irish Hollow, a bed and breakfast establishment. They gave us permission to take photos and videos from the gravel road alongside their property. It is not clear whether any of the original Chicago Great Western Railway-related structures still stand within the rail yard area. The inn's brochure suggests that a few of their buildings are old structures, but when we put this question to the inn directly, they did not provide a response. However, it does appear that the old trackway, at least, has been converted to a nature trail along the back of the property for use by inn patrons.
The small community that once stood near the Rodden Station was originally known as Green Valley, but then became known as Irish Hollow due to the presence of a handful of Irish families, including the Rodden family. After the expulsion of Native Americans in the early 1830s, the land was first settled by William Rodden, a stonemason from Ireland, and his wife, Margaret Fleming Rodden. 2 of his sons, John and James, inherited the property upon his death, and John, the younger, born in 1842 and a Civil War veteran, donated a portion of his property for the Chicago, St. Paul, and Kansas City Railroad in 1887, which named the station after him.
A U.S. post office was established at Rodden in 1891, followed by a general store in 1893. John Rodden was, not surprisingly, the first postmaster. He passed away in 1910. In September of 1929, Robert Semro, Rodden's then only storekeeper, station agent, postmaster, express agent, and cream station operator, announced he would build a combination house and store. Unfortunately for him, the U.S. Post Office service was discontinued in Rodden in 1931, taken over instead by the Elizabeth Post Office. Today, Rodden is an unincorporated community astride Irish Hollow Creek and Road in Elizabeth Township, Daviess County, consisting of the Inn at Irish Hollow bed and breakfast and a small scattering of homes.
With evening falling upon the shortened day, we'll close out this chapter of our Chicago Great Western Tour here in Rodden, in Daviess County, Illinois. Not too far to the east is the infamous Winston Tunnel, but we'll leave that for another day. Or will we? If you are enjoying these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment. It helps our channel to grow and enables us to make more videos like this. In the next episode of this journey, we'll continue westwards and explore the foreboding Winston Tunnel and beyond. We'll see you then.